Imagine, just for a moment, that you are standing on a dock in Sicily. The year is 1347. It's October. The air is cooling down, the Mediterranean sun is setting, and everything feels normal. The people of the port city of Messina are waiting for a fleet of 12 ships. These are Genoese trading galleys, coming from the Black Sea. Usually, this is a happy moment. Ships mean spices, silk, news from the east, and money flowing into the city. The dock workers are ready to unload the cargo. The merchants are rubbing their hands together. The ships appear on the horizon, cutting through the mist. But as they get closer, something feels wrong. They are drifting. They aren't moving with the sharp, crisp discipline of a merchant fleet. They're sluggish. Quiet. There's no shouting from the decks, no sailors climbing the rigging to wave at the girls on the shore. Just the creaking of wood and the lapping of water. When the first ship finally bumps against the wooden dock, the locals climb aboard to see what's going on. What they find isn't a treasure trove of silk. It's a graveyard. Most of the sailors are dead. The ones who are still breathing probably wish they weren't. They are covered in black boils that are oozing blood and pus. They are delirious with fever, shouting at things that aren't there. And scurrying between their bodies, unseen and ignored, are hundreds of black rats. And on those rats, thousands of tiny fleas. The people of Messina didn't know it yet, but they had just opened the door to the end of the world. They tried to fix it, of course. Once they realized what was happening, the harbor masters screamed for the ships to leave. They cut the ropes. They pushed the galleys back out to sea. But it was too late. The rats had already scurried down the ropes. The fleas had already jumped onto the dock workers. The Great Mortality had arrived. Now, to really understand the world of the Plague Doctor, before we even talk about the mask or the beak, we have to understand the nightmare they were walking into. We have to set the stage. Because this wasn't just a bad flu season. This was a horror movie that didn't end when the credits rolled. Within days, the sickness spread from the ports to the city centers. And it moved fast. Terrifyingly fast. There's a famous line from a writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through this. He wrote that the plague was so aggressive that a man could have lunch with his friends and dinner with his ancestors. Think about that for a second. You wake up feeling fine. You go to work. Maybe you feel a little tired around noon, maybe a slight headache. You notice a swelling in your armpit or on your neck about the size of an apple. We call them buboes. That's where the name bubonic plague comes from. By the time the sun goes down, you are burning up with fever. By midnight, you're gone. It happened so quickly that people didn't have time to process it. One day, the baker is making bread. The next day, the bakery is empty, the dough is rotting on the counter, and the door is swinging in the wind. Now, imagine the sensory overload of a medieval city during this time. Medieval cities weren't exactly smelling like roses to begin with. There was no plumbing, people threw trash in the streets, and farm animals lived in the houses. But now, the smell was something else entirely. It was the smell of sickness, of unburied bodies, and of fear. To combat this, people started burning things. They burned pine, rosemary, and incense in huge bonfires on the street corners. They thought the smoke would scrub the air clean. So, picture London or Genoa in the 1350s, a constant grey fog of wood smoke drifting through narrow, winding cobblestone streets. The sun is blocked out by the haze. It's always a little bit dark. And the sounds. Or rather, the lack of them. Before the plague, these cities were loud. Merchants shouting, blacksmiths hammering, children playing. Now, silence. The only sounds you would hear were the tolling of church bells, signaling another death. But soon, even the bells stopped ringing. There were simply too many people dying. If they rang the bell for every death, it would never stop. It would just be a constant, maddening gong driving everyone crazy. So, the churches went quiet. The social order, the rules that kept society running, completely collapsed. Usually, in a crisis, humans come together. We help each other. But the plague broke that bond. It made everyone terrified of everyone else. Since nobody knew how the disease spread, remember, they didn't know about germs yet, they just knew that if you got close to a sick person, you died. So, parents stopped visiting their sick children. Husbands left their wives. Priests, who were supposed to give the last rites to the dying, locked themselves in their churches and refused to come out. Can you blame them? It was a death sentence. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura, who lived in Siena, wrote something that breaks your heart. He said, "Father abandoned child, wife abandoned husband, one brother abandoned another, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." It was a world where money didn't matter anymore. You could walk into a rich man's house, and the door would be wide open. The silver was still on the table. The tapestries were still on the walls. But the house was silent. Thieves didn't even bother stealing, because what's the point of being rich if you're going to be dead by Tuesday? Livestock roamed free in the streets. Sheep and cows wandered through abandoned markets, grazing on the vegetables that nobody was there to sell. It was surreal. Nature was taking the cities back. And in the middle of this apocalypse, the medical system fell apart. In the medieval world, you had your high-end doctors. These were university-educated men who treated kings and bishops. They knew their Greek philosophy and their astronomy. But when the Black Death hit, these guys did something very practical. They ran away. There was a famous medical saying from the time, "Cedo, lunge, tard." It means leave quickly, go far away, and come back slowly. Great advice if you want to stay alive. Terrible advice if you're a patient. So, the rich doctors packed their bags and headed for their country estates where the air was clean. They left the cities to rot. This left a massive vacuum. The cities were dying. The mayors and town councils were desperate. The bodies were piling up in the streets, literally stacked like firewood because they couldn't dig graves fast enough. They needed someone, anyone, to take charge. They needed someone to count the dead, to lock up the infected houses, and to just try to treat the sick. But who would be crazy enough to do that job? Who would walk into the city when everyone else was running out? Who would agree to touch the things that killed everyone else? The city councils realized they couldn't hire the usual guys. They needed a new kind of professional. They needed someone expendable, someone desperate, or someone brave enough to stare death in the face every single morning. They posted job openings. They offered high salaries. They offered free houses. They promised things that most people could only dream of. And slowly, out of the woodwork, people started to apply. Some were young medical students who hadn't finished their degrees. Some were failed doctors who couldn't get clients. Some weren't doctors at all, they were fruit sellers or minor clerks who just needed the money and figured they had nothing to lose. They signed the contracts. They accepted the danger. And soon, they would put on the most terrifying uniform in human history. But before we get to the mask, we have to understand the mind of the people hiring them. They didn't know they were fighting bacteria. They thought they were fighting something much more mysterious. They thought they were fighting the air itself. And that belief that the air was poison is exactly what created the monster we know today. So, tuck yourself in. We've set the stage. The world is ending, the lights are out, and the regular heroes have all fled. It's time to meet the replacement. So, the world is ending. The ports are full of ghost ships, the bells have stopped ringing, and the graveyards are full. But here is the billion-dollar question that was haunting every single person in Europe. Why? Today, if you get sick, you know exactly whose fault it is. You blame the guy who coughed on you on the subway. You blame the undercooked chicken you ate for lunch. You blame germs. We have this invisible army of knowledge, bacteria, viruses, pathogens. We have microscopes that can show us the monsters. But in 1347, the concept of a germ didn't exist. It would be another 500 years before a guy named Louis Pasteur figured that out. Trying to explain a virus to a medieval peasant would be like trying to explain Wi-Fi to a caveman. It just didn't fit into their reality. So, without the truth, they had to invent a story to explain the horror. And the story they came up with was almost as scary as the plague itself. It starts with a smell. Welcome to the theory of miasma. If you were a doctor in the 14th century, you didn't look for flea bites. You looked at the air. The prevailing scientific theory of the day was that the air itself had gone bad. They believed that the atmosphere had become heavy, sticky, and poisonous. The word miasma comes from ancient Greek, meaning pollution or stain. The idea was actually pretty logical if you think about it. If you walk past a rotting dead animal, what happens? You smell something terrible, and your body reacts. You gag. You feel nauseous. Your instincts scream, get away from this. So, the doctors connected the dots. They thought, hey, bad smells make us feel sick. The plague makes people rot. Therefore, the plague is caused by bad smells. They believed that pockets of this corrupted air were drifting across Europe like invisible clouds of poison gas. If you breathed it in, even for a second, it would corrupt your body from the inside out. This is why, later on, the plague doctor's mask would be designed the way it was. It wasn't about filtering bacteria, it was about filtering the smell. They thought if they could just make the air smell sweet before it hit their lungs, they would be safe. But where did this bad air come from? Well, this is where things get a little cosmic. In the medieval mind, nothing happened by accident. If the air was poison, it was because the universe was angry. The top scientists at the University of Paris, the Harvard of the 1300s, sat down to figure this out. They looked at their star charts, did some math, and released an official report. Their conclusion? The Black Death was caused by a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius, which had happened on March 20th, 1345. Basically, the planets had lined up in a bad mood, and Jupiter, the hot and humid planet, had drawn up evil vapors from the earth and swamps, creating a fog of death. It sounds ridiculous to us now. Imagine going to the hospital with a broken leg and the doctor checking your horoscope before putting on a cast. But back then, this was cutting-edge science. It was the absolute truth. And this created a weird tension between the church and the early medical community. The church said, this is God's punishment for our sins. We need to pray, fast, and whip ourselves to say sorry. The doctors said, well, yes, God is mad, but the mechanism he is using is poisonous air and unbalanced fluids. So we need to fix the fluids. And that brings us to the second pillar of their reality, the four humors. This is essential. You cannot understand the plague doctor or why they tortured their patients with weird cures without understanding the four humors. The medical world believed that the human body wasn't a machine made of cells and organs. They thought it was a container holding four specific liquids. First, you had blood. This was the hot, wet energy of life. If you had too much blood, you were sanguine, happy, energetic, maybe a bit manic. Second was phlegm. The cold, sticky stuff. If you had too much of this, you were phlegmatic, slow, tired, unbothered. Third was yellow bile. This was the fiery stuff in your gut. Too much of this made you choleric, angry, and short-tempered. And finally, the worst one, black bile. This was the heavy, sludgy, depressive fluid. If you had too much black bile, you were melancholic, sad, and depressed. In their minds, health was just a balancing act. You were like a soup that needed the right amount of salt. If you got sick, it meant your soup was wrong. You had too much of one ingredient. So, When the plague hit, doctors looked at the symptoms. They saw the black boils, the fever, the coughing up of blood. And they didn't see an infection. They saw a body that was desperately trying to get rid of corrupted fluids. They thought the poisonous miasma air had entered the body, overheated the heart, and caused the blood to boil and rot. The body was producing too much toxic fluid, and it was pushing it out in the form of those horrible bumps. This belief system dictated every single thing the plague doctor did. Think about it. If you believe the problem is too much bad blood, what's the cure? You cut the patient open and let the blood out. If you believe the problem is poisonous air, what's the prevention? You seal your windows, you burn incense, and you wear a mask stuffed with flowers. It's actually tragic when you look back at it. These weren't stupid people. They were incredibly smart people working with a broken operating system. They were trying to solve a calculus problem, but they were only allowed to use an abacus. They were fighting a biological war with philosophical weapons. And this mindset created a terrifying environment for the average person. Imagine you are a peasant. You are told that the air you breathe is trying to kill you. You are told that the planets are conspiring against you. You are told that your own blood is turning into poison. You can't see the enemy. You can't fight the enemy. You can't even hide from the enemy, because the enemy is the atmosphere itself. Every breeze that blew through the window could be the one that kills your family. Every bad smell from the gutter could be a death sentence. This fear of the invisible is what set the stage for the plague doctor to become a celebrity. People were desperate for an expert. They needed someone who wasn't afraid of the bad air. They needed a specialist who knew the secrets of the planets and the humors. They needed someone who could walk into the poisonous fog and walk back out alive. But the regular doctors, the ones who treated the wealthy and knew all this theory, remember, they had fled. They were in their country villas, checking their own pulses and smelling lavender. The cities were left with a medical vacuum. The theories were there, written in big dusty books, but there was no one left to apply them. The stage was set for a new kind of character to enter the story. The city councils looked at their dying populations, looked at their empty hospitals, and realized they needed to hire some help. They didn't need the best. They just needed bodies. They needed men willing to put on the suit and apply these strange, ancient theories to the dying masses. So, they opened the city treasury. They drafted the contracts. And they began the most desperate hiring spree in history. And that is where we meet the men behind the mask. Not the experts, but the opportunists. The brave, the foolish, and the broke. Let's turn the page and see who signed up for the job from hell. Chapter 3, The City's Desperate Hiring. So, the rich doctors have fled to their country villas. The priests are hiding in the churches. The city mayor is looking out his window at a town that is rapidly turning into a cemetery, and he realizes he has a massive problem. He has plenty of sick people, but nobody to treat them. This brings us to a really interesting moment in history. It's the birth of a brand new job title, the community plague doctor. Before the Black Death, doctors were private contractors. You got sick, you called a doctor, you paid him, he gave you a potion, and he left. It was a business transaction between two people. But the plague changed the rules. The plague wasn't just an individual problem, it was a public disaster. It was like a forest fire. You don't hire a private firefighter to save just your kitchen while the rest of the neighborhood burns down. You need a public force to tackle the whole blaze. So, the city councils of Europe in places like Venice, Florence, and Pavia decided to nationalize the medical profession. They needed doctors who didn't work for patients, but who worked for the city. But who are you going to hire? The real physicians, the ones with the fancy degrees from the University of Paris or Bologna, were either gone or dead. And even if they were around, they were too expensive and too proud to touch the poor. So, the cities looked lower down the ladder. In medieval medicine, there was a strict hierarchy. At the top were the physicians. These guys were scholars. They studied Aristotle. They looked at your pee in a flask and checked the stars, but they rarely touched you. Touching was considered manual labor, and manual labor was for peasants. Below them were the surgeons and the barber surgeons. These were the guys who actually got their hands dirty. They pulled teeth, set broken bones, and cut hair. They were considered tradesmen, not intellectuals. And below them were the empirics. This is a polite word for people who just kind of figured it out. Maybe they were local healers, or apothecaries, or just guys who were good with herbs. They didn't have degrees. The medical establishment called them quacks. But when the Black Death hit, the city council stopped caring about degrees. They stopped caring about Latin. They just wanted someone willing to walk into a house marked with a red cross and not run away. This desperate need created the famous contracts of the plague doctors. We actually have some of these contracts preserved in archives, and reading them feels like looking at a deal with the devil. They are fascinating. Let's zoom in on a real guy to see how this worked. Let's talk about a man named Giovanni da Ventura. The year is 1479. The city is Pavia, in Italy. The plague is tearing the city apart. The city council is frantic. They find Giovanni. Now, Giovanni wasn't a famous medical professor. But he was available, and he had a degree in medicine, which made him a premium candidate. The negotiations between Giovanni and the city of Pavia were intense. It wasn't just here is the job, take it or leave it. Giovanni knew he was in high demand. He knew he was walking into a death trap, so he made them pay for it. The contract he signed is incredibly detailed. It gives us a perfect snapshot of what it meant to take this job. First, let's talk about the money. The city agreed to pay Giovanni a salary of 30 florins a month. Now, unless you're an economic historian, that number probably doesn't mean much to you. But in 1479, a skilled master craftsman like a guy who built cathedrals might earn 60 florins in a year. Giovanni was asking for 6 times that amount. This was life-changing money. For a struggling doctor or a second-rate surgeon, becoming a community plague doctor was like winning the lottery. Suddenly, you were one of the highest-paid public servants in the city. But the perks didn't stop at cash. The contract stated that the city had to provide him with a house. And not just a shack, a fully furnished house. If you were a young doctor living in a cramped apartment with 5 roommates, suddenly getting your own furnished home was a massive upgrade. In some cases, cities would even offer citizenship. Back then, you weren't automatically a citizen just because you lived in a town. Citizenship was a privilege. It gave you voting rights, tax breaks, and social status. For an immigrant doctor or a Jewish physician, who often faced massive discrimination, the plague doctor contract was a fast-track ticket to social acceptance. So, on paper, it looked great. High pay, free house, social status. Where do I sign? But as with any contract that looks too good to be true, there was a catch. And in this case, the catch was devastating. We call it the golden handcuffs. The city wasn't paying Giovanni 30 florins a month because they liked him. They were paying him to own him. Clause 13 of Giovanni's contract is chilling. It explicitly forbade him from treating anyone who wasn't sick with the plague. Think about that. He was not allowed to set a broken leg. He was not allowed to deliver a baby. He was not allowed to help a rich merchant with a headache. Why? Because he was contaminated. By taking the job, Giovanni became untouchable. The city needed him to work, but they also needed him to stay away from the healthy population. If a plague doctor walked into a regular shop to buy bread, people would scream and run. He was seen as a carrier of death. So, the contract effectively put him in solitary confinement. He was given a house, yes, but he was often forbidden from leaving it unless he was working. He couldn't go to parties. He couldn't go to church services with the general public. He couldn't have friends over for dinner. The contract turned him into a pariah. He was a hero, technically, but a hero that nobody wanted to be near. He was like a nuclear technician who has absorbed too much radiation, valuable, but dangerous. Giovanni also had to agree to treat everyone. It didn't matter if the patient was a count or a beggar. If they had the plague, he had to go. He couldn't pick and choose. He was a public utility, like the water supply. And the darkest part of the contract? The severance package. Usually, there wasn't one. The city councils knew the odds. They knew they probably wouldn't have to pay that high salary for very long. Most contracts were written for short terms, a few months or a year, because the expectation was that the doctor would be dead before the contract expired. In fact, in the city of Venice, they once hired 18 plague doctors. Within a year, 12 were dead and 4 had fled in the middle of the night. Only 1 or 2 were left standing. So, when Giovanni da Ventura picked up his quill to sign that parchment in 1479, he wasn't just signing a job offer. He was signing away his freedom. He was accepting that from this moment on, he belonged to the plague. He was trading his social life, his safety, and likely his future, for a few months of incredible wealth and a nice house. It was a gamble. A desperate gamble by a man who perhaps felt he had no other way to make his mark on the world. And he wasn't alone. All across Europe, thousands of men were making the same choice. They were stepping forward to become the community plague doctor. But as they started their work, they realized that just being a doctor wasn't enough. The enemy was too strong. They needed protection. They needed a barrier between themselves and the corrupted air they were wading through every day. They needed a uniform. And while Giovanni might not have worn the full birdbeak suit we know today, that invention was still a few years away. The psychological armor was already being forged. But before we put them in the suit, we need to ask a question. Who were these guys really? We know about the contract, but what kind of person actually takes it? Were they heroes? Were they fools? Or were they just broke? Let's strip away the title and look at the men themselves. Chapter 4, Who Wore the Mask? Let's play a quick game of expectation versus reality. When you close your eyes and picture a plague doctor, who do you see inside that suit? Based on the movies and video games, you probably imagine a calm, older man. A master of science. A stoic, terrifyingly intelligent figure who speaks in riddles and knows exactly what he's doing. You imagine the medieval version of a top-tier brain surgeon, or maybe a dark wizard. Well, I hate to be the one to pop the bubble, but that is almost entirely wrong. If you could time travel to 1350 or 1500 and rip the mask off one of these guys, you wouldn't find the medieval equivalent of Dr. House. You'd probably find a nervous 23-year-old kid who was sweating profusely and regretting every life choice that led him to this moment. In this chapter, we need to talk about the demographics. We need to look at the resume of the man behind the beak. Because the truth is, the job of a plague doctor was generally considered a career suicide mission. Think about it. The top physicians, the guys who were famous, wealthy, and respected, didn't need this job. They were already personal doctors to dukes and bishops. When the plague hit, they had the money to leave. They had zero incentive to walk into the slums and poke dying peasants with a stick. So, who was left? The cities were scraping the bottom of the barrel. The men who stepped forward generally fell into 3 specific categories, and none of them were master physicians. Category 1, the fresh meat. These were the recent graduates. Imagine a young man, maybe 22 years old. He just graduated from the University of Montpellier or Bologna. He has his degree, he has a head full of theory about the 4 humors, but he has no clients. In the medieval world, building a medical practice took decades. You needed reputation. You needed gray hair. Nobody trusted a doctor who didn't look like he was about to die of old age himself. So, for these young guys, The plague doctor contract was a shortcut. It was a way to skip the line. It was high risk, sure, but the reward was instant status. If you survived, and that was a massive if, you would emerge as a hero with a fat bank account. These guys weren't experts. They were interns. They were learning on the fly, experimenting on patients because they didn't really know what else to do. Category 2, the failures. This is the sadder group. These were the older doctors who just never made it. Maybe they were heavy drinkers. Maybe they had a gambling problem. Maybe they had killed a few too many patients by accident and ruined their reputation. For these men, the plague wasn't an opportunity, it was a last resort. They were the guys sitting in the back of the tavern at noon, staring into a cup of wine, when the city councilor walked in with a contract. They signed up because they had nowhere else to go. The steady salary was the only thing keeping them from starving. They weren't there to save the world, they were there to pay off their debts. Category 3, the wait, you're not a doctor guys. As the plague got worse and the death toll climbed, even the interns and the failures weren't enough. The cities got desperate. They started lowering the standards. There are records of cities hiring barbers and fruit sellers to do the job. There is a documented case in France where a merchant, a guy who sold goods, not medicine, was hired simply because he was brave enough to do it. The city basically said, look, here is the stick, here is the mask. Go count the bodies. We'll call you Dr. Dot. So, when you see that scary silhouette in the fog, remember, it might be a guy who was selling apples 3 weeks ago. But amidst all these second-rate doctors and desperate kids, there were a few fascinating outliers. There were men who took the job because they were rebels. They wanted to tear the system down. And you cannot talk about the personality of the plague doctor without talking about the rock star of the Renaissance, Paracelsus. His real name was Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Yes, his middle name was Bombastus, and that is actually where we get the word bombastic. Paracelsus was a genius, but he was also a nightmare to deal with. He was born in 1493, and he became a plague doctor in the town of Sturzing in 1534. He wasn't a failure, and he wasn't an intern. He was a revolutionary. At the time, regular medicine was obsessed with ancient Greek texts. If Galen, an ancient Roman doctor, said something 1,000 years ago, it was the law. But Paracelsus looked at the plague, looked at the old books, and said, this is all garbage. He famously stood in the town square and publicly burned the standard medical textbooks. He shouted that the universities were full of idiots. He lectured in German instead of Latin just to make the other doctors angry. Paracelsus wore the plague gear not because he was desperate for money, but because he wanted to prove his own theories. He believed that the plague wasn't caused by imbalance of humors. He believed it was a chemical problem that needed a chemical solution. While other doctors were using leeches and prayers, Paracelsus was experimenting with minerals. He used mercury, sulfur, and iron. He was actually onto something. He is now considered the father of toxicology. He's the guy who said, the dose makes the poison. But during his time as a plague doctor, people thought he was insane. He was loud, he was rude, and he was constantly getting run out of town. But he represents that strange psychological mix you found in this profession. You had to be a little bit crazy to do it. So, put yourself in the shoes of an average citizen in 1550. You are sick. You are terrified. You hear the heavy, slow footsteps on the stairs. The door creaks open. In walks a figure wrapped in black leather, wearing a giant bird beak with glass eyes. It is the most intimidating thing you have ever seen. You think, thank God, the authority is here. But inside that suit is a 24-year-old kid named Matteo. He is sweating so much that his eyes are stinging. He's gripping his cane so hard his knuckles are white. He's trying to remember a lecture he slept through 2 years ago about bloodletting. He is just as scared as you are. He knows that by walking into your room, he has probably sentenced himself to death. He is thinking about the contract he signed. He is thinking about the money he hopes to send to his mother. This reality makes them much more human, doesn't it? The plague doctor wasn't a monster. He wasn't a grim reaper. He was usually just a guy who drew the short straw in life. He was a gig economy worker in the most dangerous industry on earth. But even though they came from different backgrounds, the dropouts, the rebels, the desperate, once they put on the mask, they all shared the exact same fate. The moment they signed that contract, their old life was over. They didn't just get a new job, they got a new existence. They were cut off from the rest of the human race. Imagine finishing your shift of checking dead bodies, taking off the mask, and realizing that nobody wants to have a drink with you. Nobody wants to shake your hand. You have money, yes, but you have no one to spend it with. This brings us to the next part of their nightmare. It wasn't the work that broke them. It was the silence. Let's follow our doctor home, to the lonely house the city gave him, and see what life was like when the mask came off. Chapter 5, The Architecture of Isolation. Let's go back to our young doctor, Matteo. Or maybe Giovanni. It doesn't matter what his name is, because to the rest of the city, he has lost his name. He is now just a doctor. He has signed the contract. He has moved into the nice house provided by the city council. He has a salary that makes his father proud and his old classmates jealous. But as the ink dries on that parchment, something strange starts to happen. Matteo goes to the market to buy some apples. He walks up to the stall, just like he did a week ago. But this time, the fruit seller doesn't smile. The fruit seller's eyes go wide. He steps back. He covers his mouth with a cloth. He points to a wooden bowl on the ground filled with vinegar and says, "Put the money in there. Don't touch my hand." Matteo drops the coins into the vinegar because people believe money carried the plague and picks up his apples. The crowd around him parts like the Red Sea. No one bumps into him. No one says hello. Mothers pull their children behind their skirts as he passes. In the span of 24 hours, he has become the most important person in the city, and also the most rejected. Welcome to the architecture of isolation. We often talk about the physical danger of being a plague doctor, the bacteria, the rats, the bad air. But we rarely talk about the psychological torture. The job description effectively turned these men into living ghosts. You have to remember that humans are social animals. We need high fives. We need hugs. We need to sit in a pub and complain about the weather. But for the community plague doctor, all of that was illegal. The golden handcuffs we talked about earlier weren't just about money. They were about quarantine. When a doctor took the job, he was placed under a strict set of social laws. The first rule was simple: you do not mix with the healthy. Doctors were often forbidden from attending public gatherings. No weddings, no funerals, unless they were working, no church services. In a deeply religious society like medieval Europe, being banned from Sunday Mass was a massive deal. It meant you were spiritually cut off from the community. Some cities actually designated specific doctor houses. These were usually located on the edge of town, or near the plague pits. It was a form of house arrest. You could leave to work, but you couldn't leave to socialize. Imagine the irony. You are living in a bustling, overcrowded city. There are people everywhere. But you are in a bubble. You are like an astronaut on a space station, looking down at Earth but unable to knock on the door. And if you did have to walk through the streets, maybe to get from one patient to another, you were required to make noise. Long before they wore the beak masks, plague doctors were often required to wear bells on their belts or ankles. It was the same system used for lepers. The bell was a warning system. Ding, ding, ding. Death is coming. Clear the path. Can you imagine what that does to your head? To walk down a street and see fear in the eyes of every single person you meet? To know that your presence ruins the mood? You aren't a savior to them. You are a bad omen. If the doctor shows up at your door, it means your life is over. So, people didn't look at Matteo with gratitude. They looked at him with terror. This isolation extended to his personal life, too. Most plague doctors were unmarried. If they had wives, they often had to send them away to the countryside for safety. If they were single, well, good luck getting a date. Hey, I spend my days lancing boils on dying people. Want to grab a drink? Isn't exactly a great pickup line on Tinder in 1348. So, they lived alone. And this is where the story gets quiet. We have spent a lot of time talking about the chaos of the day, the screaming, the running, the panic. But I want you to picture the night. Let's slow down for a second. Let's settle into that bedtime story vibe we talked about. Imagine it's 2 a.m. The year is 1576, maybe in Venice or Milan. The doctor has finished his rounds. He walks back to his assigned house. He unlocks the heavy wooden door and steps inside. He locks it behind him, 3 bolts, just to be safe. The house is large, much larger than anything he could have afforded on his own. But it's empty. The furniture is stiff. The air is cold. There is no fire burning in the hearth because there is no servant to light it. Servants were too afraid to work for plague doctors. He takes off his heavy coat. It smells of wax and old blood. He takes off his boots, which are caked in the mud of the streets. He washes his hands. He scrubs them with vinegar, then with rose water, then with vinegar again. He does this until his skin is raw and red. He is trying to wash away the day. He is trying to wash away the miasma that he believes is clinging to his skin like an invisible oil. He lights a single candle and sits at a heavy oak table. He pours a glass of wine. It's expensive wine, remember, he's rich now. But he drinks it in silence. He opens his ledger. The Book of the Dead. He has to update the numbers for the city council in the morning. He dips his quill in ink and starts writing names. Giovanni. Maria. Pietro. The baker. The baker's wife. The baker's baby. He realizes that the list of people he knew growing up is getting shorter every day. He looks out the window. The glass is thick and wavy. Outside, the city is covered in a low, gray fog. Usually, a city at night has a hum. But tonight, the only sound is the creaking of cartwheels. The corpse collectors are making their rounds. They work at night to avoid panic. He hears the wooden wheels bouncing on the cobblestones. Clack, clack, clack. He hears a woman screaming in a house down the street, a raw, guttural sound of grief. He knows he should go there. But he's off the clock. And honestly, he just can't do it. Not right now. He is exhausted. His body aches. But he can't sleep. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees the faces of the people he couldn't save. He sees the desperate grabbing of hands. He hears the prayers that weren't answered. He feels a tickle on his neck. His heart stops. He slaps his neck immediately. Is it a flea? Is this it? Is this the moment that Great Mortality catches him? He rushes to a mirror, holding the candle up to his neck. He checks for the red mark. He checks his armpits for the swelling. Nothing. Just an itch. Just a regular, harmless itch. He lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He pours another glass of wine. His hands are shaking. This was the reality of the architecture of isolation. It wasn't just about being lonely. It was about being trapped in a psychological pressure cooker. You were the guardian of the city, but you were also its prisoner. You were waiting, every single night, for the inevitable to happen. Most doctors knew they wouldn't survive the contract. They knew they were dead men walking. The isolation gave them too much time to think about it. In the dark, alone in that big empty house, the fear didn't come from the rats. It came from the silence. But as the years went on, the doctors realized that vinegar and isolation weren't enough. The bad air was too strong. The fear was too penetrating. They needed something more substantial to put between themselves and the world. They needed a barrier that was physical, not just social. They needed to disappear completely. And luckily for them, or perhaps unluckily for our nightmares, a man in France was about to invent exactly what they were looking for. He was about to invent the ultimate uniform of isolation. Blow out the candle. The doctor is going to sleep. But when he wakes up, the world is going to look very different. Chapter 6, 1619, The Invention of the Armor. We need to make a very important correction to your mental timeline. If you hopped in a time machine right now and traveled back to the peak of the Black Death in 1348, the year half of Europe died, and you looked around for a guy in a beak mask, you wouldn't find him. You would look everywhere. You'd check the hospitals, the graveyards, the ships. But that famous, terrifying Birdman figure? He wasn't there. This is the biggest misconception about the plague doctor. For the first 300 years of the plague, doctors just looked like, well, doctors. They wore long robes, sure. Maybe they held a little sponge soaked in vinegar up to their nose if things got really smelly. But they didn't have a uniform. Their faces were exposed. Their hands were often bare. They were walking into a biological war zone wearing the equivalent of business casual. It wasn't until nearly 3 centuries later that someone finally said, hey, maybe we should cover up. The year is 1619. The location is Paris. And the man who is about to change fashion history and horror history forever is named Charles Delorme. Now, Charles Delorme wasn't some desperate medical school dropout like the guys we met in the last few chapters. This guy was the real deal. He was a celebrity doctor. He was the primary physician to 3 different French kings, Henri IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV. He was rich, he was respected, and he was incredibly confident. He was also a bit of a character. He lived to be 92 years old in a time when the average life expectancy was about 40. He credited his long life to his own brilliance, mostly. Because he was so high status, people listened to him. When Charles Delorme had an idea, the medical world took notes. And in 1619, watching another wave of the plague crash through Paris, Delorme decided that the medical community needed a standard uniform. He realized that doctors were dying because they were exposed. They needed armor. But you can't fight the plague with steel. You can't stab a sickness with a sword. So, Delorme designed a different kind of armor. He designed a suit intended to seal the doctor off from the entire world. He wrote down his design in a treatise, and it reads like instructions for building a tank. He called for a strictly regulated outfit made of Moroccan leather. Why Moroccan leather? At the time, leather from Morocco was considered the highest quality. It was goat leather, incredibly tough, but also flexible. It wasn't like the cow leather we use for jackets today. It was lighter but very dense. But Delorme knew that leather has pores. It breathes. And if air can get in, the miasma can get in. Remember, the enemy is the bad air. So, he added the secret ingredient that made the suit truly effective, wax. He ordered that the entire leather coat, the breeches, and the gloves be impregnated with aromatic wax and suet, which is hard animal fat. Basically, they took the leather outfit and greased it until it was waterproof. This was a stroke of accidental genius. Delorme thought the wax would stop the poisonous air from sticking to the doctor's clothes. But what he actually created was a primitive hazmat suit. Think about the environment these guys were working in. Patients were coughing up blood. Buboes were bursting. Fluids were everywhere. If you were wearing a wool robe, that fluid would soak right in. It would stay wet. It would bring the bacteria home with you. But on Delorme's wax leather suit, the fluids just slid right off. It was like a raincoat. A flea couldn't nest in it because there was no fabric weave to grab onto. It was just a slippery, waxy surface. So, let's build the outfit, piece by piece, as Delorme described it. First, you have the boots. These were also made of Moroccan leather. They were thigh-high. Then, you have the breeches, the pants. These were connected to the boots. Then, the long coat. This was the centerpiece. It went all the way down to the ankles. It was heavy, stiff with wax, and designed to cover as much of the body as possible. The coat was tucked into the breeches, and the breeches were tucked into the boots. Do you see what he's doing? He's creating a seal. He's trying to make sure there is no gap where the air can touch the skin. Next came the gloves. Delorme specified that the gloves should be long and made of the same wax leather. Finally, on top of the head, the doctor wore a wide-brimmed leather hat. This wasn't just for style. The hat indicated their profession, like a chef's hat or a policeman's cap, but it also acted as a shield to stop bacteria-filled rain or waste from falling onto the mask. When you put it all together, the result was terrifyingly effective. Imagine wearing this thing. It's the middle of summer. You are wrapped head to toe in heavy goat leather. And on top of that, you are covered in wax and animal fat. It was hot. It was heavy. And it smelled. It smelled of old grease and sweat. Moving in it would have been difficult. The stiff leather would creak and squeak with every step. Squeak, squeak, squeak. But for the first time in history, the doctor was safe. Well, safer. Delorme had accidentally invented the concept of personal protective equipment, PPE. Before this, medicine was offensive, you attacked the disease. Delorme introduced defensive medicine. The logic was sound: if the world is toxic, build a wall between you and the world. This suit became the standard uniform for community plague doctors across Europe. It started in France, spread to Italy, and then moved to Germany and Austria. Suddenly, the silhouette in the mist changed. It wasn't just a guy in a robe anymore. It was this shiny, stiff, artificial figure. When the sun hit the wax coat, it probably gleamed like a beetle shell. To the peasants, this new look was horrifying. It looked unnatural. It looked like a giant insect walking on two legs. But to the doctors, specifically the ones terrified of dying, this suit was a godsend. It was a barrier. It allowed them to walk into a room full of death and feel like they were inside a fortress. However, there was one piece of the puzzle missing. Delorme had covered the feet, the legs, the body, the hands, and the top of the head. But the face was still a problem. You couldn't just wrap leather over your face, you needed to see, and you needed to breathe. But breathing was the most dangerous part. If the air is poison, how do you breathe without dying? Delorme knew he needed a filter. He needed a gas mask. But they didn't have charcoal filters or oxygen tanks in 1619. So, he looked at nature. He looked at the design of the human nose, and he decided it wasn't long enough. The air didn't have enough time to get clean before it hit the lungs. He needed to extend the nose. He needed a shape that could hold a filtration system. And what shape is long, hollow, and points away from the face? A beak. The suit was the armor, but the beak was the engine. The beak was the piece of technology that was supposed to actually scrub the air clean. And the stuff they put inside that beak? That is a whole other story. It's a recipe that sounds more like a witch's potion than medicine. So, now that we have our doctor dressed in his squeaky, waxy, leather armor, let's look at the most famous part of the ensemble. Let's talk about why on earth they decided to dress like birds. Chapter 7, Deconstructing the Beak. Alright, we have covered the coat, the boots, and the gloves. We have turned our doctor into a walking, squeaking fortress of wax leather. But now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the bird in the room. The beak. This is the single most recognizable part of the uniform. It's the reason why, for 100 years later, we are still obsessed with these guys. If Charles Delorme had just given them a regular round bag over their heads, nobody would be making Halloween costumes of them today. But he gave them a beak. And we have to ask, why? Was it aesthetic? Were they trying to scare the plague away by looking like a giant, angry crow? Actually, no. The beak wasn't a fashion statement. It was a piece of engineering. It was arguably the first gas mask in human history. To understand the beak, you have to go back to the miasma theory we talked about earlier. Remember, they believed the air itself was poisonous. They thought the plague was a foul vapor that entered through your nose and rotted your brain. So, Delorme had a problem. He needed to scrub the air before it hit the doctor's nostrils. If you put a flat mask right against your face, the air travels a very short distance, maybe half an inch, before you breathe it in. That's not enough time to clean it. But if you create a beak, suddenly, the air has to travel 6 inches through a tunnel. And if you pack that tunnel with the right stuff, you can filter it. Think of the beak as a cone-shaped air purifier. It had 2 small nostrils at the end, usually near the tip. The air would flow in through those holes, travel up the length of the beak, pass through a dense mixture of herbs and spices, and finally reach the doctor's nose, smelling sweet and clean. But they didn't just stuff some old leaves in there. The contents of the beak were serious business. The mixture inside was called theriac. Theriac was the wonder drug of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It was a secret recipe that went back to the ancient Greeks. It was supposed to cure everything: poison, snake bites, and the plague. The recipe was incredibly complex. It could have over 55 different ingredients. The base was usually something strong and sticky, like honey or pitch, to hold everything together. Then they added the aromatics. They used dried flowers like roses and carnations. They used strong spices from the east like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. They used pungent stuff like garlic and camphor. They even used opium, which might explain why some doctors felt surprisingly calm while walking through a literal apocalypse. But the weirdest ingredient? The one that makes you realize just how desperate they were? Dried viper flesh. Yes, snakes. They would catch vipers, dry them out, grind them into a powder, and mix them into the paste. Why? Well, the logic was actually kind of poetic. Doctors knew that snakes shed their skin. To the medieval mind, this meant snakes knew the secret of eternal youth and regeneration. They thought if you breathed in the essence of a snake, your body would learn how to regenerate, too. So, picture our doctor, Matteo. He's packing his beak in the morning. He takes a handful of the sticky, spicy, snake powder paste and shoves it into the nose of the mask. He packs it tight, like loading a musket. He puts the mask on. He takes a breath. The smell would have been overpowering. Imagine sticking your nose into a jar of really strong perfume, incense, and old honey, and then keeping it there for 8 hours. It was thick. It was heavy. But to Matteo, that smell was the smell of safety. As long as he could smell the cinnamon in the snake, he knew he wasn't smelling the death outside. Now, let's look at the eyes. If you look at authentic masks in museums, you'll notice the eyes are almost always made of glass. And often, they are perfectly round, like goggles. This wasn't just to keep blood from splashing into their eyes, though that was a nice bonus. The glass had a spiritual purpose. We have to remember that in the 1600s, science and magic were still kind of dating. They hadn't broken up yet. People believed in the evil eye. They believed that a sick person could curse you just by looking at you. If a dying victim stared into your eyes with enough envy and hatred, they could transmit the disease through their gaze. It sounds crazy to us, but think about how uncomfortable it is when someone stares at you on the bus. Now imagine that person is dying of a contagious disease. You naturally want to look away. The glass lenses were a shield. They believed the glass would deflect the evil gaze of the patient, protecting the doctor's soul from getting infected along with his body. So, the mask was doing double duty. The beak protected the lungs from the air, and the glass protected the soul from the stare. Now, I want you to close your eyes for a second. Let's try to simulate what it actually felt like to wear this thing. We always look at the mask from the outside. But what was it like inside? It was a nightmare. First of all, it was hot. The mask was usually made of leather, which doesn't breathe. As soon as you put it on, your own body heat got trapped. Within 5 minutes, you would be sweating. Sweat would run down your forehead and sting your eyes, but you couldn't wipe it away because your hands were covered in wax gloves and you weren't allowed to touch your face. Then, there was the vision. The glass eyes were small. You had zero peripheral vision. You could only see what was directly in front of you. It was like looking through 2 toilet paper tubes. This is why they needed the cane, which we will get to next, to feel where they were walking, because they were half blind. And the sound. Have you ever worn a really tight Halloween mask? Or a scuba mask? The world outside gets muffled. The sounds of the city, the church bells, the crying, the wheels of the carts would have sounded distant and underwater. But inside the mask, it was loud. Every time Matteo breathed, the sound would echo in the leather cone. Hoo! Hoo! It was the Darth Vader effect, centuries before Star Wars. He would hear his own ragged breathing, amplified. He would hear his own heart beating in his ears. And then, the air supply. Remember, he is breathing through a tube packed with sticky herbs. It's not a free flow of air. He has to work for it. He has to suck the air in through the blockage. This meant the carbon dioxide he was breathing out would often get trapped in the beak. He was constantly rebreathing a little bit of his own bad air. This leads to a condition called hypercapnia, too much CO2 in the blood. It makes you feel dizzy. It makes you feel drowsy. It can make you hallucinate. So, it is very likely that many of these plague doctors were walking around in a semi-drugged haze. Between the opium in the beak, the lack of oxygen, and the heat exhaustion, they were practically tripping. Maybe that's why they were able to do the job. They were literally insulated from reality. So when we see the mask today, we see a symbol of death. We see a monster. But if you could shrink yourself down and stand inside that beak, you would realize it wasn't a mask of power. It was a mask of panic. It was a desperate, claustrophobic cage that smelled like potpourri, designed by men who were terrified of the air they breathed. But the beak was only half of the defense. The doctor couldn't just stand there and breathe. He had to interact with the world. He had to touch the sick. And since he couldn't use his hands, he needed an extension of his arm. He needed a tool that became the symbol of his authority and his cruelty. He needed the white cane. Chapter 8, The Cane of Authority. So, our friend Matteo, the nervous, sweaty doctor inside the leather suit, is almost ready to go. He has the boots. He has the wax-coated coat. He has the gloves. He has the terrifying bird mask stuffed with dried snake and cinnamon. He looks less like a human being and more like a fever dream of a giant crow. But before he unlocks his front door and steps out into the fog, he needs one last thing. He reaches into the corner of his hallway and picks up a long, wooden stick. This isn't a walking stick. Matteo isn't old, and he doesn't have a limp. This is a tool. In fact, next to the mask, this is the most important piece of technology he owns. This is the cane. Now, in modern pop culture, the cane is usually just there to make the doctor look cool. It gives him a bit of a gentlemanly swagger, like a Victorian dandy who took a wrong turn into a horror movie. But in reality, that cane was the Swiss Army knife of the 17th century. It was a medical device, a communication tool, and a weapon, all rolled into one. The cane was usually about the size of a billiard cue. It was often painted white. This wasn't a fashion choice, it was for visibility. In the dark, gloomy streets of a plague-infested city, you wanted people to see the white stick coming and get out of the way. It was a visual siren. But its main purpose was something we became very familiar with in 2020, social distancing. The cane was the physical enforcement of the 6-foot rule. Remember, the doctor believes that the patient is a biological bomb. If he touches the patient with his hand, even with a gloved hand, he believes the miasma or the poison might stick to him. He wants to be in the same room as the patient, but he wants to be as far away as physically possible. So, the cane became his hand. Let's visualize a typical examination. Mateo walks into a dark bedroom. The air is thick with the smell of sickness. A man is lying on the bed, groaning. His wife is standing in the corner, weeping. Mateo does not sit on the edge of the bed. He stands back. He extends the cane. He uses the tip of the stick to lift the bed sheets. He uses it to lift the patient's shirt. He uses it to poke and prod the body. He is looking for one specific thing, the buboes. These are the swollen lymph nodes, big, black, painful lumps that appear on the neck, the armpit, or the groin. If Mateo needs to check the patient's neck, he doesn't use his fingers. He uses the cold, wooden tip of the cane to tilt the patient's chin up. If he needs to check the armpit, he uses the cane to lift the arm. It's a dehumanizing process, isn't it? Imagine being sick, scared, and in pain, and the doctor refuses to touch you. He just pokes you with a stick like you're roadkill. But for the doctor, this distance was sanity. It was the only way he could do his job without having a panic attack. But the cane wasn't just for examinations. It was also a remote control for the room. The plague doctor was the highest authority in the house. When he walked in, he was the captain of the ship. But he didn't want to do any heavy lifting. He didn't want to open windows or move bodies. So, he used the cane to direct the family. He would point the stick at the wife and gesture for her to open the curtains to let in clean light. He would point the stick at the son and order him to strip the clothes off the patient. He would point at a tray of food and signal for it to be taken away. He was the conductor of a very sad orchestra. There are even accounts of doctors using the cane to take a pulse. They would place the stick against the patient's wrist and put their ear to the handle, trying to feel the vibrations. Did it work? Probably not. What isn't exactly a high-tech stethoscope. But it made them feel like they were doing something scientific without breaking the safety barrier. However, there is a darker use for the cane that we have to talk about. The streets of a plague city were not safe. We aren't just talking about germs here. We are talking about people. When society collapses, people get desperate. And people get angry. Imagine you are a father. Your child is dying. The doctor comes in, pokes your child with a stick, shakes his head, and turns to leave. He offers no cure. He offers no hope. And he's wearing a suit that costs more than your house. You might get angry. You might try to grab him. You might try to rip that mask off his face to see the man who is letting your child die. Or, imagine the paranoia. There were conspiracy theories back then that the doctors were actually spreading the plague to keep their jobs. We call this the Untori conspiracy, the idea of the anointers who smeared poison on doors. So, sometimes, a mob would surround a doctor. They would throw stones. They would try to beat him. In those moments, the medical instrument became a weapon. The cane was heavy. It was made of solid wood. And the doctor would use it to beat people back. He would swing it to keep the desperate mothers and the angry mobs at bay. There is a tragic irony there. The tool designed to heal, or at least diagnose, became a tool to hurt. Some of the fancier canes even had hidden features. We have found canes in museums with heavy metal knobs on the top, effectively turning them into maces. Others had hollow compartments for storing vinegar sponges or aromatic herbs, so the doctor could take a quick sniff of safety if the mask wasn't working well enough. Occasionally, you might see a cane with a very specific topper, an hourglass with wings. This is a symbol of tempus fugit, time flies. It was a reminder to the patient and the doctor that life is short and death is fast. It was a pretty grim thing to wave in the face of a dying person, but subtlety wasn't really the plague doctor's strong suit. So, let's look at Matteo again. He is standing in the street. He has his leather armor. He has his beak. And now, he has his white baton. He grips it tight. The wood is smooth from years of use. Maybe it was used by the doctor before him, the one who didn't make it. The cane completes the transformation. Without the cane, he is just a guy in a weird costume. With the cane, he is an authority figure. He is a judge. He holds the stick that separates the clean from the unclean, the living from the dead. The cane is the physical line in the sand. On one side of the stick is the doctor, the science, and the hope of survival. On the other side is the patient, the chaos, and the plague. And the most terrifying thing about the cane? The fact that it's only 3 feet long. That's the margin of error. That's the safety zone. A measly 3 feet of wood is the only thing keeping Matteo from joining the pile of bodies he is about to go count. He taps the cane on the cobblestones. Clack. He taps it again. Clack. It's a rhythm. It's the sound of his job beginning. The sun is coming up. The mist is clearing just a little bit. The bells on his belt are jingling. It's time to go to work. Let's follow him on his morning rounds and see what a typical day in the life actually looks like. Because if you think the outfit is scary, wait until you see what he has to do with it. Chapter 9, A Day in the Life. Okay, so we have built the suit. We have packed the beak with snake powder. We have grabbed the white stick. We have turned a normal human being into a terrifying, wax-covered birdman. But now, we have to put him to work. It's easy to look at a museum exhibit and think, wow, cool costume. But it is much harder to imagine what it was like to actually wake up, put that thing on, and go to work on a Tuesday morning. So, let's do exactly that. I want you to imagine it's 5:30 a.m. The sun hasn't come up yet. The city, let's say we are in Rome, 1656, is quiet. But it's not a peaceful quiet. It's a heavy, nervous quiet. Inside the city-provided house, our doctor, Matteo, is waking up. He doesn't hit a snooze button. He probably didn't sleep much anyway. The first thing he notices when he opens his eyes is the smell. Even in his own bedroom, the smell of the wax leather suit hanging in the corner is overpowering. It smells like a candle factory exploded inside a barn. He gets out of bed. The floor is cold. He splashes some water on his face, maybe vinegar water, just to be safe. And then, the ritual begins. Getting dressed for work today takes 5 minutes. Getting dressed as a plague doctor took about half an hour. It wasn't something you could just slip into. It was an operation. First, the heavy linen undergarments. Then, the boots. He has to lace them up tight, all the way up the thigh. Then the breeches, tucked into the boots. Then comes the coat. The Moroccan leather armor. As he puts it on, it fights him. It's stiff. It's cold from the night air. He has to shove his arms through the sleeves, and the whole thing creaks like an old ship. Crinkle, squeak, crack. He buttons it all the way up to the chin. He checks for gaps. He checks the seams. Remember, a gap isn't just a wardrobe malfunction, it's a leak in the hull of a submarine. He ties the belt around his waist. On the belt, he hangs his tools. A pouch of garlic cloves. a jar of vinegar, a knife, and most importantly, the bells. He shakes his hips a little. Jingle, jingle. The sound is bright and sharp. It cuts through the silence of the room. That sound is going to be his soundtrack for the next 12 hours. Finally, the hood goes up. The hat goes on. And the last piece, the mask. He holds it in his hands for a second. It looks back at him with those empty glass eyes. He takes a deep breath of clean bedroom air, and then he pulls the straps over his head. The world disappears. His peripheral vision is gone. The room goes dim. The smell of the room is replaced by the intense, spicy punch of the theriac herbs inside the beak. He is no longer Matteo. He is the doctor. He grabs his cane, unlocks the heavy front door, and steps out into the mist. The walk to the first patient is a surreal experience. Usually, when you walk down a street, you are part of the crowd. You weave around people, they weave around you. But when a plague doctor walks down the street, the crowd evaporates. As Matteo walks, the bells on his belt announce him. People don't even need to look up. They know that sound. Imagine walking down a busy street and having the waters part for you. Mothers grab their kids and yank them into doorways. Men press their backs against the walls, holding cloths over their faces, turning their heads away. Nobody says good morning. Nobody makes eye contact. Matteo is the most visible person in the city, but he is completely ignored. It's a very specific kind of loneliness. He is walking in a bubble of fear. He consults his list. The city council has given him a route. He turns a corner into a poorer district. The streets here are narrower. The smell of sewage and sickness is stronger. He can smell it even through the cinnamon in his beak. He stops in front of a house. He knows it's the right one because of the paint on the door. A crude red cross, sometimes accompanied by the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." This is the mark of the plague. This house has been identified. It has been flagged. Matteo doesn't knock with his hand. He lifts his cane and raps it hard against the wood. Bang! 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 The sound echoes in the empty street. Inside, he hears shuffling. He hears a woman crying. Slowly, the bolts are drawn back. The door creaks open. The air that rushes out of the house is warm and stagnant. This is the moment of maximum danger. This is where the miasma lives. Matteo tightens his grip on the cane and steps over the threshold. The house is dark. The windows are shuttered because, ironically, people thought keeping the windows closed would keep the bad air out. In reality, they were just trapping the bacteria inside. His glass eyes adjust to the gloom. He sees a family huddled in the corner. They look at him like he's a monster from a nightmare. The children scream. The beak, the coat, the rod, it's terrifying. He doesn't speak. It's hard to talk through the mask anyway. His voice comes out muffled and deep. He just points with the cane. He points to the bed in the center of the room. There is a man lying there. He is sweating, shaking, delirious. Matteo approaches. He keeps his distance, the full length of the cane. He uses the tip of the stick to pull down the blanket. The smell gets worse. He uses the stick to lift the man's shirt. He is looking for the verdict. And there it is. Under the armpit. A swelling the size of an egg. Black and purple. The diagnosis is confirmed. This is the hardest part of the job. It's not the medical part, it's the judicial part. Matteo now has to be the judge. He lowers the shirt with the stick. He turns to the family. He doesn't offer comfort. He can't. There is no cure he can give them that will actually work, though he might try later. He nods to the head of the household, or whoever is left standing. He pulls out his ledger and writes down the name. By writing that name, he has just sealed their fate. He signals that the house must be fully quarantined. In many cities, this meant the door would be locked from the outside. The family would be trapped in there with the dying father. They would not be allowed to leave for 40 days. Essentially, by diagnosing the father, Matteo is sentencing the rest of the family to death, too. They will almost certainly catch it in that sealed box of a house. He sees the panic in their eyes. He sees the wife begging. She might try to approach him, to grab his coat, to offer him money to not write the name down. Please, sir. It's just a fever. It's just a cold. Don't lock us in. Matteo raises the cane. He points it at her chest. Stay back. He cannot accept the bribe. If he does, and the infection spreads, the city council will hang him. He finishes writing. He backs out of the room, keeping the cane pointed at them like a weapon until he is out the door. He steps back onto the street. The door is closed. He marks it again or tells the city guards to seal it. He stands there for a second, breathing hard inside the mask. The sweat is already trickling down his back. The beak is starting to feel heavy. That was one house. He looks down at his list. He has 20 more to visit before lunch. He adjusts his belt. The bells jingle. He starts walking to the next door. Clack, clack, clack. But what happens when he decides to actually treat the patient? What happens when he stops being a judge and tries to be a healer? If you think the diagnosis was scary, wait until you see the cure. Because the things these doctors did to try and fix the plague were often more painful than the disease itself. Let's open the medical bag and see what horrors are inside. Chapter 10, Treatments and Tortures. So, the diagnosis is done. Matteo has poked the patient with his stick, he has seen the black lumps under the arm, and he has written the name in his book. The family is crying in the corner. Now comes the part where he actually tries to be a doctor. And honestly, this is the part where you should probably be glad you were born in the era of antibiotics and ibuprofen. Because if you think the diagnosis was scary, wait until you see the cure. In modern medicine, the goal is usually to make the patient comfortable and help the body fight the infection. In the 17th century, the goal was, well, it was more like an exorcism. They believed the body was full of poison, and they had to get it out by any means necessary. And any means necessary usually meant torture. Let's look at the tools Matteo has on his belt. He puts down the cane for a second. He reaches into his leather pouch and pulls out a knife. It's not a sterile scalpel. It's a heavy, iron blade. Maybe he wiped it on his wax coat to clean it. Maybe he didn't. The first and most common treatment for the plague was lancing the buboes. Remember those egg-sized lumps filled with black fluid? The doctors believed those were trash bags. They thought the body had collected all the toxic humors and stuffed them into these lymph nodes. The logic was, if we pop the balloon, the poison leaves, and the patient gets better. So, Matteo approaches the bed. He signals for the family to hold the patient down. There is no anesthesia. There is no numbing cream. There is just a leather strap to bite on if you're lucky. Matteo slices into the bubo. I won't get too graphic, but imagine the smell. The pressure releases. The poison drains out. To the doctor, this looked like success. He saw the black fluid leaving the body and thought, good job, me. But then, he had to make sure the wound stayed open so it could keep draining. So, they would often stuff the open cut with a mixture of strange things, sometimes a paste made of tree resin, white lilies, and human excrement. Yes, you heard that right. They put poop in the wound. They thought the heat of the manure would draw out the sickness. In reality, they were taking a person who was already fighting a massive infection and literally rubbing E. coli into their bloodstream. If the cutting didn't work, they moved to cauterization. This is exactly what it sounds like. Matteo would take a piece of iron, heat it in the fireplace until it was glowing red, and then press it directly onto the bubo. The idea was to burn out the poison. The scream of the patient would have been muffled by the walls of the quarantined house. And Matteo, standing there in his mask, probably felt nothing. He couldn't hear much, and he believed he was saving a life. But let's say the patient was too weak for the knife. What else did Matteo have in his bag? Welcome to the mercury cure. Today, we know mercury is incredibly toxic. If you break an old thermometer, you call a hazmat team. But back then, mercury was considered a magical cleaner. It was heavy, it was shiny, and it seemed to eat through things. The doctors thought, hey, this stuff destroys metal, so maybe it will destroy the plague. They would make a salve out of mercury and fat. Then, they would coat the patient in it. Or, in extreme cases, they would put the patient in a small, enclosed room kind of like a sauna and heat a bowl of mercury over a fire. The patient would sit there, breathing in the toxic silver fumes, sweating it out. The result? The patient would start drooling uncontrollably. Their teeth would loosen and fall out. They would get the shakes. The doctors looked at this and said, it's working. They thought that drooling was the body expelling the bad humors. They didn't realize they were just giving the poor guy heavy metal poisoning on top of the Black Death. It was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. And of course, we can't talk about medieval medicine without talking about the greatest hit of all time, bloodletting. This goes back to the four humors. If you were sick, it meant you had too much blood, sanguine fluid, and it was overheating your body. The solution was simple: open a vein. Matteo would tie a tourniquet around the patient's arm. He would make a small incision, usually in the forearm or sometimes the neck. He would let the blood flow into a bowl until the patient fainted. The logic was that by lowering the volume of blood, you were lowering the fever. It's like draining oil from a car engine to cool it down. But the plague attacks your heart. It makes your blood pressure drop. It causes internal bleeding. The last thing a plague victim needed was to lose more blood. By draining them, the doctors were just speeding up the process of death. If Matteo didn't want to use a knife, he would use leeches. He would carry a jar of river leeches in his pocket. He would stick them on the buboes. The leeches would swell up as they drank the blood. When they were full, they dropped off. It was a slower, more natural form of bloodletting, but it was just as useless. And then, there were the wait, are you serious, cures. The desperate, Hail Mary plays that make absolutely no sense to us today. There was the Vickery method, named after a doctor named Thomas Vickery. This involved, and I promise I am not making this up, taking a live chicken or a pigeon. You would pluck the feathers off its backside. Then, you would strap the bare butt of the live bird directly onto the plague sore. The belief was that the bird would breathe in the poison from the sore through its rear end. And when the bird died, which it usually did, from shock, they assumed it had absorbed the plague. Then they would grab another pigeon and repeat the process. Imagine being the patient. You are dying. You are in agony. And a man in a giant bird mask is strapping a live chicken to your neck. It sounds like a fever dream, but it was standard medical practice. Finally, there was the treacle or theriac, that same stuff inside the doctor's mask. Sometimes they didn't just smell it, they fed it to the patient. A spoonful of snake powder, opium, and honey. Honestly, this was probably the only treatment that actually helped, largely because the opium would knock the patient out so they didn't feel the pain of dying. The tragedy of all this, the part that really hurts when you look back at history, is that almost everything Matteo did made the situation worse. We have analyzed these treatments with modern science. Lancing the buboes? It turned a contained infection into an open wound, leading to septic shock. Bloodletting? It weakened the immune system and caused heart failure. The mercury? It destroyed the nervous system. And the tools? Matteo didn't know about germs. He didn't sterilize his knife between patients. He would cut a dying man in house A, wipe the blade on his coat, walk to house B, and cut a man who might have just had a mild fever. He was a vector. The doctor himself was often the one spreading the plague. The healer was actually a biological weapon. So, after about 20 minutes of torture, Matteo finishes. He bandages the wounds, probably with dirty linen. He tells the family to pray. He picks up his cane. He taps it on the floor. I have done all I can, he says. And sadly, he is right. He has done all he can to ensure the patient dies faster. He walks out of the dark, smelly room and back onto the street. He pulls a little notebook from his belt. He isn't done yet. Because being a plague doctor wasn't just about medicine. It was about bureaucracy. The city council didn't just pay him to treat people, they paid him to count them. He has to update the score. Let's follow him to the town hall, where the real grim reality of his job sets in. He's not just a doctor. He's the accountant of death. Chapter 11, The Accountant of Death. We need to take a step back and look at the job description of a plague doctor again. We usually think of them as medical professionals. We picture them trying to save lives, even if they were terrible at it. But if you look at the city archives, the actual paperwork from places like Venice, Milan, and London, you realize that healing people was actually their secondary job. Their primary job wasn't to save you. It was to count you. Welcome to the most bureaucratic part of the apocalypse. Imagine for a second that the world is ending. People are dying in the streets. But the government is still the government. They still want their paperwork filed in triplicate. They still want the data. So, when our friend Matteo finishes poking his patient with a stick and putting leeches on the buboes, he doesn't just go home. He has to go to the town hall. He has to meet with the city magistrates. He has to become the accountant of death. This chapter is about the books of the dead. Every major city during the plague kept strict records. In London, they were called the Bills of Mortality. They were weekly reports that listed exactly how many people died and what killed them. The city councils were obsessed with these numbers. Why? Because the numbers dictated the economy. If the death count went up, the city would close the gates. Trade would stop. The markets would shut down. If the death count went down, the gates opened and money started flowing again. The plague doctor was the only source of this data. He was the human sensor on the ground. So, every evening, Matteo had to sit down with his quill and ink and report the score. District of San Marco, 14 deaths. 3 recoveries, unlikely. 12 new infections. He held the keys to the city's economy. If he said the plague was getting worse, the city locked down. This gave him immense power, but also immense pressure. But the accounting wasn't just about numbers. It was about law enforcement. This brings us to the darkest part of the doctor's duties. We talked about the cane being a tool of distance. But the pen was a tool of imprisonment. When a doctor diagnosed a person with the plague, he wasn't just giving a medical opinion. He was issuing a legal verdict. If Matteo wrote your name in his book, your life as a free citizen was over. This triggered the quarantine laws. The word quarantine comes from the Italian word quaranta, which means 40. The idea was that if a ship arrived from a plague-ridden port, it had to sit at anchor for 40 days to see if anyone died. If they were still alive after 40 days, they were clear. The doctors applied this same logic to houses. Let's go back to that dark room with the dying father and the crying family. Matteo has made the diagnosis. He has written the name. Now, he steps outside and calls for the city guards. The guards arrive with hammers, nails, and wooden planks. In many cities, the law was brutal. If one person in the house had the plague, The entire house was sealed. It didn't matter if the wife was healthy. It didn't matter if there were 3 little kids running around who felt fine. They were all guilty by association. Mateo would stand in the street, watching as the guards literally nailed the door shut from the outside. Sometimes, they would even brick it up. They would paint a large cross on the door, red in London, white in other places. And then, the guards would be posted outside to make sure nobody got out. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Mateo knows that the father is going to die. But he also knows that by locking the wife and kids in that small, unventilated space with a dying man, he is effectively killing them too. He is trapping them in a viral oven. He knows that in a week, he will probably be back to count their bodies. But he does it anyway. Why? Because his job is to save the community, not the individual. He is looking at the big picture. He is sacrificing a few to save the many. It's a ruthless, mathematical calculus. And the people inside knew it. There are heartbreaking stories of families begging the doctor through the window, offering him money, jewelry, anything, just to let the healthy children leave. Take the boy, they would scream. He's not sick. Let him go to his aunt's house. Lock the rest of us in, but save the boy. And Mateo would have to shake his head. His beak would dip. He would point his cane at the window and order them to step back. If he let the boy go, and the boy was carrying the sickness, Mateo would be responsible for the next 1,000 deaths. So, he became a jailer. This role gave the doctor a terrifying amount of authority over the personal lives of the citizens. He was the one who decided when the quarantine started. He was the one who decided when it ended. And he was also the one who decided what happened to your stuff. In many cities, the law stated that the belongings of a plague victim had to be destroyed. Clothes, bedding, curtains, anything that could hold the miasma had to be burned. So, after the family died, the doctor would order the purge. He would stand there as the corpse bearers dragged the bodies out. Then, he would watch as they stripped the house. They would throw the furniture out the window. They would pile the family's heirlooms in the street and set them on fire. For a wealthy family, the doctor's visit didn't just mean death, it meant bankruptcy. It meant the erasure of their legacy. This is where the accountant of death title really hits home. He was auditing their lives. He was deciding what was safe to keep and what had to be destroyed. Now, imagine the stress of doing this every single day. Mateo isn't a robot. He's a human being, probably a young, scared one, remember? How do you sleep at night when your day consisted of locking healthy children in a room with a corpse? How do you drink your wine when you can still hear the sound of the hammer banging nails into the door? This is why so many plague doctors cracked. It wasn't just the fear of getting sick. It was the moral injury. It was the guilt. They were walking a tightrope between being a savior and being a monster. To the city council, they were heroes doing the hard work of containment. To the families on the ground, they were the Grim Reaper's secretaries. And here is the thing about giving a man that much power. When you give a person the power to lock people up, the power to burn their property, and the power to decide who lives and who dies, well, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Not every doctor was a noble hero like Mateo, trying his best to follow the rules. Some of them looked at this chaos and saw an opportunity. They looked at the fear in people's eyes and saw a way to get rich. If you have the power to write plague or not plague in the book, you have the power to demand a bribe. So, let's leave the sad, dutiful Mateo for a moment. Let's turn our attention to the darker side of the profession. Let's talk about the scammers, the thieves, and the absolute villains who put on the mask not to save the city, but to rob it blind. Chapter 12, The Thief, the Quack, and the Hero. We have spent a lot of time talking about the plague doctor as a tragic figure. We've painted a picture of a young, scared guy named Mateo, walking into hell with a stick and a bird mask, trying his best to hold civilization together. And that version of the story is true. There were hundreds of men who died trying to save their neighbors. But human nature is a complicated thing. And if history has taught us anything, it's that whenever there is a crisis, there is someone looking to make a quick buck off of it. For every noble doctor who held the hand of a dying child, there was another one eyeing the family silver on the mantelpiece. So, we have to take off the rose-colored glasses for a minute. We need to talk about the corruption. Because when law and order collapse, the line between a doctor and a criminal gets very, very blurry. Let's start with the Quack. Remember how we said the cities were desperate to hire anyone? Well, that meant the vetting process was practically non-existent. If you were brave enough to wear the suit, you got the job. This opened the door for every snake oil salesman, con artist, and failed alchemist in Europe. These guys didn't care about the Hippocratic Oath. They cared about the upsell. Imagine you are sick. You are terrified. The doctor walks in. He looks at your buboes and shakes his head. It looks bad, he says. The standard cure won't work. But... And here comes the pitch. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a small, dirty vial. I have this. It's crushed unicorn horn mixed with liquid gold. It's guaranteed to cure you. But the city doesn't pay for this. You have to buy it yourself. Was it unicorn horn? Of course not. It was probably chalk dust and old wine. But a desperate family would pay anything. They would hand over their life savings for a bottle of colored water. There are records of doctors selling plague water, magic amulets, and even holy dust swept from the floors of specific churches. They were selling hope to people who had none, and they were charging a premium for it. But the scams were the nice part of the corruption. At least they were offering a product. Then, there was the thief. Think about the unique position the plague doctor was in. He was the only person allowed to enter the homes of the dead. When a wealthy merchant died, his family was often either dead too, or locked away in quarantine in a different room. The house was empty. It was full of expensive tapestries, jewelry, gold coins, and silk. And nobody was watching. The doctor was supposed to be supervising the destruction of goods to stop the infection. But who is to say that a gold ring didn't accidentally fall into the deep pockets of that wax coat? Who is to say that a bag of coins didn't get confiscated for safety and never seen again? It was the perfect crime. If the family died, there were no witnesses. If they survived, who were they going to believe? The hero doctor who risked his life, or the traumatized survivors? There were stories of doctors who became incredibly wealthy during the plague years, not from their salaries, but from the inheritance tax they collected while the bodies were still warm. Some of them got even darker. We talked about the power of the ledger, the power to write a name in the book of the dead. Well, that power could be weaponized. Imagine a doctor walking into a healthy house. He looks at the father, who is perfectly fine. The doctor leans in and whispers, "You look a little pale. I think I see a swelling on your neck. I might have to quarantine this whole house." The father knows what that means. It's a death sentence. Unless, the doctor says, rubbing his gloved fingers together. Unless I'm mistaken. Maybe for 50 gold florins, I'll realize my mistake. It was pure extortion. The golden handcuffs we talked about earlier turned into a shakedown. But the most fascinating, and honestly the most terrifying story of corruption isn't about theft. It's about a conspiracy theory that drove Europe absolutely insane. It's the story of the Untori. The word Untori means the anointers or the greasers. As the plague dragged on for years, people started to get suspicious. They looked at the doctors, the gravediggers, and the corpse carriers. They realized something. Wait a minute. These guys are getting rich. They have steady jobs. They have power. If the plague ends, they go back to being nobody. So, a dark theory started to spread. The people believed that the doctors were keeping the plague alive on purpose. The theory was that the doctors were brewing a special plague poison, a yellow, sticky goo made from the pus of the dead. They believed the doctors were walking through the city at night, smearing this goo on door handles, church pews, and public fountains. They believed the doctors were farming the disease. Now, does this sound like a crazy conspiracy theory? Yes. Was it true? Probably not. But in the middle of mass hysteria, the truth doesn't matter. In Milan in 1630, this fear exploded. People reported seeing men in black cloaks greasing the walls. If a doctor was seen touching a building, a mob would form instantly. He's an untowar. Get him. There is a famous historical case involving a health commissioner named Guglielmo Piazza. He was accused of being an untowar. He was arrested and tortured. Under torture, which will make anyone confess to anything, he admitted that yes, he was spreading the plague, and he implicated a barber named Giangiacomo Mora. They were both executed in a horrific public spectacle. The city then destroyed Mora's house and built a column of infamy on the spot to warn other poisoners. It's a tragic example of how the heroes became the villains. The very men hired to stop the plague were accused of manufacturing it. It got so bad that some doctors stopped wearing the outfit. The beak mask, which was supposed to be a shield, had become a target. If you wore the beak, you were telling the mob, I profit from your death. So, doctors were attacked in the streets. They were stoned. They were beaten with their own canes. It adds a whole new layer of horror to the job, doesn't it? You are walking into a house to treat a patient, knowing that the family hates you, fears you, and suspects you of trying to kill them. You are the boogeyman. And we must end this chapter on it, but we cannot let the thieves and the scammers define the whole group. Because for every guy selling fake unicorn dust, there was a guy like Guy de Chauliac, who we will meet properly in the next chapter. There were men who caught the plague, survived it, and went right back to work. There were doctors who stayed in the city when the walls were closing in, knowing they would never get paid because the treasurer was already dead. There were men who sat by the bedsides of orphans, holding their hands so they wouldn't die alone, breathing in the stench of death through a beak full of wilting flowers. They weren't all saints. Some were sinners of the highest order. But in the chaos of the Great Mortality, humanity showed its true face. It showed the greed, the cruelty, and the fear. But it also showed the stubborn, irrational bravery of the man who wakes up, puts on the mask, and goes to work one more time. But now, we need to zoom in. We've talked about the generic doctor. Now, I want to introduce you to the specific legends. The celebrities of the Black Death. Let's meet the famous figures in the fog. Chapter 13, Famous Figures in the Fog. By now, we have a pretty clear image of the plague doctor. We know the suit, the smell, the tools, and the terrible odds of survival. We've met the scammers selling fake cures and the desperate kids trying to pay off their student loans. But history isn't just made up of nameless faces in the crowd. Among the thousands of men who donned the beak mask, there were a few who stood out. These were the rock stars of the apocalypse. Some of them you have definitely heard of, but you probably didn't know they started their careers fighting the Black Death. So, let's clear the fog for a moment and shine a spotlight on three specific men. One was a mystic, one was a genius, and one was just a guy trying to pay the rent. First up, let's talk about the most famous plague doctor of all time. You know his name, but you probably know him as a wizard, not a doctor. Michel de Nostradamus, better known as Nostradamus. Yes, that Nostradamus. The guy who supposedly predicted World War II, the moon landing, and the rise of the internet in his book of cryptic poems. But before he was the world's gloomiest fortune teller, Nostradamus was a boots-on-the-ground physician fighting the plague in the south of France in the 1500s. And here's the crazy thing, he was actually really good at it. While other doctors were bleeding their patients dry or feeding them mercury, Nostradamus was doing something radical. He was telling people to clean up. He created a rose pill, a lozenge made of rose hips, sawdust, iris, and cloves. He told his patients to keep this pill in their mouths. Now, to the people of the time, this looked like magic. But if you look at it with modern eyes, it makes a lot of sense. Rose hips are packed with vitamin C, way more than oranges. By giving his patients a massive dose of vitamin C, he was boosting their immune systems. He also rejected the standard medical practices of the day. He hated bloodletting. He thought it was stupid to drain a sick person's energy. Instead, he advocated for fresh air, clean water, and removing the rotting corpses from the streets immediately. Basically, if Nostradamus was alive today, he would be a wellness influencer selling smoothies on Instagram. But in the 16th century, his methods were revolutionary. He realized that hygiene mattered. He didn't save everyone tragically. His own wife and 2 children died of the plague while he was out treating others, which is a heartbreak that probably led him into his darker, prophetic phase, but his survival rate was much higher than the guys using leeches. He proved that sometimes, common sense is the best medicine. Next, let's move from the mystic to the scientist. Let's talk about Guy de Chauliac. If Nostradamus was the rebel, Guy de Chauliac was the establishment. He was the personal physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon during the first massive outbreak in 1348. Now, serving the Pope during the plague was a weird job. The church was terrified. Everyone thought the end of the world was here. Guy de Chauliac is famous for 2 things. First, the barbecue defense. He advised the Pope to sit in his private chambers between 2 massive, roaring fires. The Pope sat there for weeks, sweating in the heat, while the plague destroyed the city outside. It sounds insane, but it worked. The heat and the smoke likely kept the fleas and the rats away. The Pope survived. But Guy de Chauliac didn't just hide. He went out into the city. And inevitably, he caught the plague himself. This is where he becomes a legend. Most people, when they catch the Black Death, just lie down and die. Guy de Chauliac lay down and took notes. He observed his own body as it was failing. He tracked the fever. He touched his own buboes. He survived the illness, which was incredibly rare, and used his own experience to write the Chirurgia Magna, the Great Surgery. In this book, he was the first person to clearly distinguish between the 2 types of plague. He realized there was the bubonic plague, the one with the lumps, which you could catch from fleas. But he also identified the pneumonic plague, the one in the lungs, which you caught from other people coughing. He wrote, "The father did not visit his son, nor the son the father." Charity was dead. He was the first guy to really understand the mechanics of the contagion. He didn't just wear the mask, he looked behind it. He was a true scientist in an age of superstition. Finally, let's go back to the everyman. Let's check in on Giovanni da Ventura. We met him in Chapter 3. He was the guy who signed that strict contract with the city of Pavia in 1479. Giovanni isn't famous because he invented a cure. He isn't famous because he wrote a book. He is famous because he represents the reality of the job. We actually have records of his time and service. And it turns out, Giovanni was a bit of a stickler for the rules. The archives show that Giovanni complained to the city council. He told them the house they gave him was too cold. He told them he wasn't getting his salary on time. He was a union man before unions existed. But the most interesting thing about Giovanni is that he actually survived his contract. Most doctors died within months. Giovanni da Ventura finished his term. He treated the sick, he counted the dead, and he came out the other side. But here is the tragedy of Giovanni's success. Even though he survived, his career as a normal doctor was over. Once you were a plague doctor, you were marked. You were the death doctor. Rich clients didn't want you touching them. They felt like the bad luck stuck to you. So, Giovanni, and men like him, were often forced to travel from one plague-infested city to another. They became nomads of death. They followed the disease because it was the only employer that would hire them. Giovanni represents the hundreds of forgotten men who did the job, followed the rules, and got nothing but a bad reputation in return. So, why do these three men matter? Because they show us the spectrum of humanity behind the beak. You had the intuitive genius of Nostradamus, trying to use nature to heal. You had the brave scientist guy Chaliak, using his own suffering to learn the truth. And you had the working class hero Giovanni da Ventura, just trying to do his job and get paid. They were all fighting an enemy they couldn't see, with weapons that barely worked. And speaking of weapons that barely worked, we have spent a lot of time describing the suit. The wax, the leather, the herbs, the beak. We know why they wore it. We know they thought it worked. But looking back with modern science, did it? Was Charles Delorme's leather suit actually a stroke of genius, or was it just a hot, sweaty placebo? It turns out, the answer is a little bit of both. Let's strip the doctor down and put his armor under the microscope. It's time to ask the big question, did the suit actually save anyone? Chapter 14, did the suit work? We have reached the part of the story where we have to put on our lab coats. We've spent the last hour walking through the fog with Matteo, smelling the spices, hearing the bells, and feeling the terror. We've seen the suit as a symbol of fear and a symbol of authority. But now, I want to look at the suit as a piece of technology. Because here is the wildest thing about the plague doctor's uniform. It was designed based on completely wrong science, the miasma theory. It was built using materials that belong in a shoe factory, leather and wax, and it was stuffed with superstitious ingredients, snakes and flowers. By all logic, it should have been useless. But if we look at it through the lens of modern germ theory, we find something shocking. It actually worked. Well, kind of. It worked accidentally. Let's break it down, piece by piece, to see how Charles Delorme stumbled backward into inventing a functional hazmat suit. First, let's look at the biggest accidental victory, the wax coat. Remember, Delorme wanted the coat to be waxed so that the bad air wouldn't stick to it. He thought the poison was a sticky vapor. He was wrong about the vapor, but he was right about the texture. To understand why, we have to look at the real enemy. It wasn't the air. It was the flea. The Xenosiliciopes, or the oriental rat flea. This little guy was the sniper of the Middle Ages. It carried the Yersinia pestis bacteria in its gut. When a rat died, the flea would jump off, looking for a new warm body. Usually, that body was a human leg. Fleas are designed to grab onto things. They have little hooks on their legs that allow them to latch onto wool, linen, or hair. If you were a normal doctor wearing a wool robe, you were basically a giant Velcro strip for fleas. You would walk into a patient's house, 5 fleas would jump on your hem, crawl up your leg, and bite you. Game over. But the plague doctor's suit? It was polished leather coated in hard animal fat. It was slippery. Imagine a flea trying to jump onto a greased-up slide. It can't get a grip. It slides right off. The heavy boots and the tucked-in breeches meant there was no skin exposed for the flea to bite. So, without even knowing it, Delorme had created a suit of armor that was effectively flea-proof. As long as the doctor kept his coat greased, the primary carrier of the disease couldn't touch him. Now, let's look at the beak. For centuries, people mocked the beak. They thought it was just a primitive air freshener. But in 2020, we all learned a lot about droplets, didn't we? The plague came in 3 flavors. Bubonic, fleas, was the most common. But pneumonic plague was the one that spread through the lungs. If a patient coughed on you, you breathed in the bacteria, and you were dead in 48 hours. Explore. The beak acted as a primitive baffle system. Think about it. The doctor is breathing through a 6-inch cone packed tight with herbs and sponges. The air has to fight its way through that stuffing. Did the dried snake powder kill the bacteria? Absolutely not. but the density of the stuffing acted like a filter. It stopped the large droplets. If a patient coughed directly into the doctor's face, the spit would hit the leather beak or get caught in the herbs at the tip. It wouldn't make it all the way to the doctor's nose. It wasn't an N95 mask, obviously. Microscopic particles could still get through. But it was a heck of a lot better than breathing open air. And don't forget the glass eyes. We know today that you can catch viruses through the mucous membranes in your eyes. If someone sneezes and a droplet hits your eye, you can get infected. The glass goggles sealed that entry point off completely. So, let's look at the scorecard. Coat blocks fleas. Beak blocks droplets. Cane keeps people 6 feet away. Charles Delorme, working with zero knowledge of bacteria, had essentially built a level 1 biosafety suit. However, before we give him a Nobel Prize, we have to talk about the failure points. Because while the suit was good, the protocols were terrible. The biggest danger wasn't wearing the suit. It was taking it off. In modern hospitals, taking off a hazmat suit, we call it doffing, is a slow, careful ritual. You have to make sure you don't touch the outside of the suit with your bare skin. You peel it off inside out. You shower immediately. Our friend Matteo didn't know any of that. Imagine he comes home after a long day. His coat is covered in flea dirt, rat droppings, and patient fluids. The bacteria are sitting on the surface of the wax. He is tired. He unbuttons the coat with his gloved hands. Then, he takes off his gloves. Then, he touches the coat again to hang it up. Boom. Cross-contamination. He has just transferred the bacteria from the coat to his hands. Then he rubs his eyes, or eats a piece of bread. He survived the day, but he infected himself in his own hallway. There was also the issue of the vents. The beak needed holes for air to get in. Usually, these were 2 small nostrils at the end. If the doctor leaned in too close to a patient, and the patient exhaled right at that moment, the bad air, the bacteria, could be sucked right into the intake vents. And then there is the miasma trap. Remember how they thought the suit protected them from smells? Well, sometimes the doctors would go into a house, do their work, and then go home to their families wearing the clothes underneath the suit. The suit protected the doctor, but the doctor himself became a carrier. He might track fleas into his own home on the soles of his boots. He might carry the bacteria on his hair if the hood slipped. So, did the suit work? If we look at the mortality rates, the answer is, sort of. Plague doctors still died in huge numbers. Remember that statistic from Venice? 12 out of 18 died. That's a 66% mortality rate. That sounds terrible. But you have to compare it to the general population in the worst hit areas, which sometimes saw death rates of 80% or 90% for those who stayed in the city. And you have to remember that these doctors were interacting with the sick all day long. They had a viral load exposure that was 1,000 times higher than the average person. The fact that any of them survived is a miracle. And that miracle was largely due to the wax and the leather. If they had worn wool robes like the priests, the survival rate would have been 0. The fleas would have eaten them alive on day 1. So, in a weird way, the suit was a success. It allowed a small percentage of these men to keep working, keep counting, and keep witnessing the end of the world, long after they should have been dead. It was the best technology they had. It was a clumsy, hot, terrifying, accidental shield. But even the best shield can't stop a war forever. Eventually, the enemy has to retreat. And that is exactly what happened. The Great Mortality didn't last forever. The fires burned out. The rats moved on. And the world began to wake up from the nightmare. But when the plague ended, what happened to the men in the masks? They were heroes during the war. But what do you do with a soldier whose uniform scares children? What do you do with a man who reminds everyone of the worst days of their lives? Let's turn to the next chapter and watch the plague doctor fade into history, leaving behind nothing but a ghost story. Chapter 15, The Vanishing of the Black Death. All nightmares have to end eventually. Even the ones that last for 300 years. We have spent this entire story in the fog. We've been stuck in the gloom of the 14th, 15th, and 17th centuries, surrounded by the smell of burning rosemary and the sound of the death carts. But if you look at the timeline of history, something incredible happens. The waves of the plague start to get smaller. They get further apart. And then, finally, they stop crashing against the shore altogether. The Black Death didn't disappear overnight. It wasn't like a war where someone signed a peace treaty and everyone went home. It was more like a slow, retreating tide. But why? How did humanity finally beat the boss level? It wasn't because of the vaccines, those didn't exist yet. It wasn't because of the antibiotics. And, spoiler alert, it definitely wasn't because of the bird masks. The end of the plague is actually a really weird mix of accident, violence, and biology. One of the biggest turning points happened in London in 1666. London had been getting hammered by the plague for a year. The city was a mess of wooden shacks, open sewers, and narrow streets where you could shake hands with your neighbor across the road. It was a 5-star hotel for rats. Then, a baker on Pudding Lane left his oven on. The Great Fire of London is usually taught as a tragedy. And sure, burning down 13,000 houses is bad news for the real estate market. But for the plague? It was a nuclear option. The fire burned so hot and moved so fast that it effectively sterilized the city. It incinerated the filthy slums. It killed the rats by the thousands. It burned the fleas. It wiped the slate clean. When London was rebuilt, it was built with brick and stone, not rotting wood. The streets were wider. The airflow was better. Without meaning to, the fire had destroyed the plague's habitat. It was extreme remodeling, but it worked. But fire wasn't the only hero. The other hero was a bully. Specifically, a new kind of rat. For centuries, the carrier of the plague was the black rat. The black rat was a climber. It liked to live in your attic, in your thatched roof, and in your walls. It was a house rat. It liked to be close to humans. That meant its fleas were close to humans, too. But in the 1700s, a new guy arrived in Europe, the brown rat, also known as the Norway rat. The brown rat was bigger, meaner, and more aggressive. And it hated the black rat. The brown rats effectively went to war and pushed the black rats out of the cities. But here's the key difference: the brown rat doesn't like attics. It likes sewers. It likes damp, dark basements. It stays away from humans. So, when the rats moved from the roof to the sewer, the fleas went with them. The chain of transmission was broken. It was an accidental ecological shift that saved millions of lives. And finally, humans just started acting a little less gross. Hygiene slowly improved. We started using soap more often. We stopped throwing garbage out the window. We started burying the dead deeper. Bit by bit, the miasma lifted. But what did this mean for our friend Matteo? Let's go back to our plague doctor. He is sitting in his house, sharpening his cane, checking his wax coat. He is waiting for the next wave. He is waiting for the bells to start ringing. But the bells stay silent. A week goes by. Then a month. Then a year. The city council stops sending him the lists of the dead. The quarantine guards go back to their regular jobs. The red crosses on the doors fade in the sun. For the city, this is a miracle. But for the doctor, it's an identity crisis. You have to remember, these men had built their entire lives around the apocalypse. They were specialists. They were plague doctors. That was their title. If there is no plague, what are they? They are just guys in weird leather costumes. The end of the plague meant the end of the contracts. The city councils looked at the budget and said, "Why are we paying Matteo 30 florins a month? Nobody is dying." So, they fired them. The golden handcuffs were unlocked. Matteo was free to leave the city. He was free to treat normal patients again. But here is the sad reality: nobody wanted him. Imagine you are a regular person in 1720. You have a stomach ache. You need a doctor. Do you hire the guy who spent the last 10 years poking dead bodies with a stick? Do you hire the guy whose face is associated with the worst trauma of your life? No. You hire a clean doctor. You hire the guy who fled to the countryside and came back looking tan and healthy. The plague doctors were stigmatized. They were walking reminders of death. When people saw them, they didn't feel gratitude. They felt PTSD. They were like Grim Reapers who had lost their scythes. So, many of them drifted into poverty. Some tried to reinvent themselves as regular physicians, but their reputation followed them. Oh, that's Matteo. He's the one who boarded up the miller's house and let them all die. Don't let him touch you. Others became travelers, moving east where the plague still flared up occasionally, chasing the disease because it was the only thing they knew. And what happened to the suits? This is the most haunting image for me. Picture Matteo standing in his bedroom. The war is over. He doesn't need the armor anymore. He takes off the heavy leather coat. It's cracked and worn. It smells of old wax and sweat. He hangs it in the back of a wardrobe. He takes the cane, the white one of authority that used to make crowds part like the Red Sea, and he props it up in the corner. Maybe he uses it to shoo away a stray dog later. It's just a stick now. And then, he picks up the mask. He looks at the beak. He looks at the glass eyes. This thing protected him. It terrified people, but it kept him alive. It's his face. But he can't wear it outside anymore. If he wears it now, people will throw stones. They will laugh. Or worse, they will panic. So, he puts the mask in a box. He packs it away with the dry herbs and the old ledgers. He closes the lid. The era of the beak is over. But the mask didn't disappear. It didn't rot away in that box. Something very strange happened to the image of the plague doctor. Usually, when a historical figure becomes obsolete, we forget about them. Who remembers what a 17th century chimney sweep wore? Who knows what a medieval tax collector looked like? But we didn't forget the plague doctor. Instead of fading into history, the doctor migrated. He moved from the hospital to the stage. He moved from the nightmare to the carnival. He became a character. As the real danger faded, the image of the doctor began to change. He stopped being a figure of genuine terror and started to become something theatrical. The Italians, with their love of drama, looked at that mask and thought, you know what? That would look great in a comedy. It sounds twisted, but that's how humans deal with trauma. We turn our monsters into puppets. So, let's turn the page to the final chapter. Let's look at how Matteo's terrifying uniform went from the streets of dying cities to the canals of Venice during Carnival. Let's look at how the plague doctor became a ghost story we tell ourselves in the dark. Chapter 16, From History to Nightmare. So, Matteo has put his mask in a box. The plague is over. The rats have moved to the sewers. The world is breathing a sigh of relief. You would think that this would be the end of the story. You would think that the beak mask would just become a dusty artifact in a museum, something we look at and say, wow, the 1600s were weird. But that's not what happened. The plague doctor didn't die. He just changed careers. He went from being a medical professional to being an actor. About the same time the real plague was fading, a form of theater called Commedia dell'arte was blowing up in Italy. This was like the Saturday Night Live of the Renaissance. It was improv comedy using stock characters. You had the greedy merchant, the clever servant, the young lovers. And suddenly, a new character walked onto the stage. They called him Il Medico della Peste, the plague doctor. But here is the twist, he wasn't scary. He was hilarious. In these plays, the plague doctor was a buffoon. He was a satire of the real doctors who had failed to save everyone. He would walk on stage wearing the full beak mask and the leather coat, but he would trip over his own cane. He would mix up his potions. He would diagnose a man with pregnancy or prescribe toasted cheese for a broken leg. He spoke in fake Latin that sounded fancy but meant nothing. The audience loved it. They roared with laughter. Why? Because for centuries, these people had been terrified of the doctor. He was the symbol of their worst nightmare. By turning him into a clown, they were taking the power back. It was a coping mechanism. If you can laugh at the monster can't hurt you anymore. For about 200 years, the image of the plague doctor wasn't associated with horror, it was associated with carnival. It became a popular party costume in Venice. People would wear the beak mask to balls and flirt with each other. It was edgy, sure, but it was fun. But then, time passed. The generation that remembered the real plague died out. The generation that remembered the funny plays died out. And the context was lost. By the time we got to the Victorian era and the 20th century, we looked at old drawings of this figure, and we didn't see the satire anymore. We didn't see the protection. We just saw a 6-foot-tall human-bird hybrid dressed in black leather. And it terrified us. The plague doctor was reborn as a horror icon. Today, if you see a plague doctor in a movie or a video game, he isn't usually the good guy. He's the villain. He's the mad scientist experimenting on people in a dungeon. He's a supernatural entity that brings death wherever he walks. We fear him because he hits that uncanny valley. He looks human, but not quite. The beak distorts the face just enough to trigger our predator instincts. It looks like a scavenger bird, a crow or a vulture waiting for us to die. And there is a deep psychological irony here. This suit was invented to save lives. It was designed by Charles Delorme to protect the healer. It is a symbol of medicine. Technically, a plague doctor is on the same team as a modern nurse in Scrubs. But we have twisted the meaning completely. The symbol of healing became the symbol of the disease itself. When we see the beak, we don't think help is on the way. We think, run. It's a bit unfair to poor Matteo, isn't it? He spent his life sweating inside the wax oven, dodging stones and fleas, trying to save the city, only for history to remember him as a nightmare. But maybe that's the price of admission for entering the history books. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to become a Halloween costume. Conclusion: the human beneath the leather. So, we have reached the end of our rounds. We have walked through the fog of 1347. We have smelt the burning rosemary and the rotting garbage. We have felt the weight of the cane and the sting of the vinegar. We started this journey by looking at a monster. A silhouette in the mist. A spooky image that we put on t-shirts and tattoo on our arms because it looks cool. But I hope, after spending the last hour, or 90 minutes, if you're listening to this in bed, with me, you don't see the monster anymore. I hope you see the man. I want you to picture the plague doctor one last time. But don't picture him as a statue. Picture him as a person. Picture him as a 25-year-old medical dropout who took the job because he needed to pay his mother's rent. Think about the physical sensation of his life. The way the wax coat squeaked every time he moved. The way the glass goggles fogged up when he breathed too hard. The way his hands shook when he had to write the name of a child in his Book of the Dead. These men were the astronauts of their time. Think about it. An astronaut puts on a specialized, airtight suit to step into a hostile environment where a human being cannot survive. They carry oxygen. They carry tools. They are isolated from the world they are walking on. The plague doctor was doing the exact same thing. But instead of walking on the moon, he was walking into the slums of London or the ports of Genoa. The environment was just as deadly. The alien force he was fighting, the bacteria, was just as mysterious to him as dark matter is to us. And he didn't have mission control. He didn't have a radio. He was alone. Most of them died. They died painful, lonely deaths, often abandoned by the very cities they tried to save. Their bodies were thrown into the same pits as their patients. There are no statues of Giovanni da Ventura in the town square. But they showed up. That is the legacy that matters. In the face of the apocalypse, when the kings ran away, and the bishops locked the church doors, and the rich doctors fled to their villas, these guys stayed. They signed the contract. They put on the ridiculous, terrifying, smelly suit. And they walked into the dark. So the next time you see that beak mask, whether it's in a movie, at a costume party, or in a history book, don't shudder. Nod your head. Because behind the beak, there was fear. But behind the fear, there was a man who chose to stay. Sleep well.